Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to Talent Assessment's Golden Era webinar this afternoon. I am Greg Moran, CEO and president of Check.com, who is sponsoring this webinar today with our special guest, Dr. Charles Handler, to be talking about, assessments and what to expect in the future for your organization. So I'm pleased everybody could join us today. Just real quick, by way of introduction here, in case you're not familiar with Checked, we actually provide web applications for talent selection, pre-employment assessment upfront, all cloud-based applications, and then on the back end, predictive and automated reference checking to really make reference checking faster, easier, and most importantly, a critical part decision tool in your talent selection process. So that's a little bit about what Check does, but this afternoon is not really about us, but really about what Dr. Handler has to say about building assessments into your organization. Before we get going, just a couple quick ground rules that we want to make sure you understand. First, you can scream, you can yell, you can curse, you can do whatever you want in the background, but we can't hear you. So, in other words, if you have a question, please use the questions box on your screen. We'll be periodically taking some questions throughout the webinar. We'll be taking as many as we can at the end. So as you think of the questions, go ahead and write them right into that question box. They'll come to us, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can in the time we have today. So don't try to remember till the end. Go ahead and use that box all during the webinar. And if you want to be social, you want to talk to each other. Go ahead and use hashtag Checked on Twitter. It's hashtag CHEQUED, and that's the best way to communicate with each other. So those are the ground rules. There's not a whole lot else that we need to cover, fortunately, before we get into the main content here. And I am pleased today, actually, to introduce Dr. Charles Handler to you. And if you're not familiar with Charles or Charles's work, he is the president and founder of Rocket Hire. And throughout his career, he specialized in developing effective and legally defensible employee selection systems. He's taken what he's learned while developing recruitment and selection solutions for a wide variety of organizations, and then combined it with his love of technology to really help clients develop new models for employee selection. He's got a core philosophy that focuses around combining sound science with innovation and practicality to really create online hiring strategies that really provide ROI and demonstrate the real value of human capital to an organization. He's got a Ph.D. in industrial psychology, and he's just one all-around smart guy. So I'm pleased to have Charles with us today. So thanks for joining us, Charles.
Hey, thanks a lot, Greg. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to having a little bit of time today to just discuss some of the things that I work with on a regular basis and kind of help everyone understand a little bit about assessment. We have a quick poll to get things started here, so if you don't mind just taking a second to weigh in there out there in the ether in the audience to let us know. We'll be able to kind of address this a little bit as we go on. But I'm just really happy to be able to have the chance to talk to everyone today, and thank you so much for your time. I know everyone's busy, and let's see. I guess that
so we're going to give that poll about 5 more seconds here, or 10 more seconds, and we've got most of the audience polled. And really, the assessment question today is around the poll question today is around what form of assessments do you use in your organization. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to close that poll out and go ahead and share the results on the screen here. And again, Charles, any big surprises there? I assume you can see the results.
Yeah, I can. No, not at all. I think that it's pretty representative, and a lot of the work that I've done over the past decade or so has been really kind of checking in and seeing what kind of tools people use. And I generally find that it's pretty evenly distributed, although this is these results are pretty consistent with what I generally find, which is, a really high level of use for knowledge and skills testing and the behavioral type testing. As you get into more very precise or specific types of tests like integrity tests, you get less usage there. And, on the reference checking side, that's probably even a little bit higher than I've seen in the past. And I think a lot of that's attributed to folks like Check that are making it easier to integrate that into the whole assessment process. And we'll talk a little bit, and I think really one of the major themes of the discussion today is to talk about how something like a reference check or even a post-hire evaluation can then loop back into the evaluation of how effective your assessments are. So there's really some new opportunities afforded by by technology and by integration of platforms and things like that to take a look at data about how someone's performed in another situation or even in the current job once they're hired, and close the loop, so to speak, and be able to understand the value that the hiring process and the tools you're using provide. So it's really exciting for geeks like me that are really into data, and for also, honestly, someone as a professional serving organizations as a practitioner who likes to see results, right? I mean, I kind of wear both, have a foot in both worlds with what I've been doing, and spend a lot of time, looking at spreadsheets and doing a lot of that less exciting stuff, but also a lot of time in the halls of organizations, helping them with their strategies and helping them. At the end of the day, it's about delivering an ability to show ROI, allowing staffing to become a business and allowing that business to have some credibility and some equal footing with other areas of the business.
Absolutely.
So it can become a profit center as opposed to a black hole. Really,
Absolutely. So you should have the controls now, and
okay.
and fire away. Go.
Let's see if I can figure out how to advance the slide here. Okay, here we go. I got a next. Can I just use my arrows, actually?
You can just yep.
Page down it. Let's see. Yep.
There you go.
Awesome. So, well, just a quick overview of the agenda today. Talking a little bit about just pretty standard fare for the presentations that I give. But what is assessment? Why does it work? What is the value it has? I think it's a really important foundation before we begin talking about all kind of other things that are more complicated and downstream. So we'll have a good understanding there. I'll talk a little bit specifically about the idea of validation and how we collect data to understand how effective assessments can be, and then talk about really what I think is a strong emerging trend, and that is linking your talent acquisition and your talent management. So the pre-hire to retire, employee life cycle, it's called all kind of different things, but we'll talk a little bit about how to make that a reality. We talk about it a lot in the abstract and say it's a good thing to do. The reality is, as they say, the devil's in the details, and we'll talk a little bit about what those details might look like. And then it's pretty much wide open after that point. Greg and I'll have some conversation. We'll field questions from the audience, so please don't be shy about throwing some questions up there for us to discuss, and we'll be kind of twittering and talking and all that kind of stuff simultaneously throughout the presentation. So we'll go ahead and get moving here. Let's see if I can get the slide to advance. It seems like it's not advancing on me. Hang on a second here. There we go. Good. Oops, now I'm going too fast. I think it's a little bit of a delay effect. Here we go. So background information. Basically, it's about the why, why and the how. Why should we bother investing in this, and how do we do it are two pretty critical questions, and I want to try to answer those questions. I want to start with the how of what is assessment, and I think everybody's got a pretty good idea. We all have taken employment tests over the years, and probably very few of us actually enjoy that experience, but nonetheless, that's what we think about. But the reality is that it's a little bit of a bigger picture when you think about it, especially in the eyes of the EEOC and other people who powers that be, who think about the hiring process. Technically, any method that's used to evaluate qualifications for doing a job or working in an organization can be deemed an assessment. The reality is it is mostly tests, but all the other usual suspects in a hiring process are part of it too. And really, the thing that's most important is these things are predictors. They really provide, again, as a psychologist, I keep going back to the fact that it's about measurement. It's about taking a construct or an area that allows someone to contribute to being successful in the job and effectively measuring that and then understanding how well we're measuring. So in some sense, I like to talk about assessment, and I'll talk about it a little more in the evaluation area, but if you're familiar with Six Sigma methodology of basically, you design something, you implement it, you measure and evaluate it, and then you improve it. That's the model that I really feel like is best for this type of predictive assessment. It doesn't end when you put a test in place. You really need to collect data and do what I call closing the loop, and that's why, I'm so happy to be giving this presentation today, which is really, in my mind, all about that. How do we close the loop and really understand the power and accuracy and value of the decisions we make using tools? So not getting too ahead of myself. So, and why is it important to think about assessment? What does it tell us? It really tells us it's about predicting future performance. Everything that we're doing is about evaluating someone and saying, okay, what are they going to be able to do for us in the future? Because the reality is when people come into a hiring process externally in an organization, they're generally an unknown entity. You don't know much about them, and the whole hiring process is a dialogue between the company and the prospective applicant, where everyone's trying to uncover more information, and we're trying to see through the BS and the smoke and mirrors to really that goes in both directions, being honest, to figure out, is it a good fit? Well, assessments allow us to look at three major buckets of things. What somebody can do, what I call their mental horsepower, or their mental and psychological makeup, what they've done in the past, the things that they bring to the table, and then very importantly, what do they want to do, the motivational component. And I think we've all had jobs where we've been able to do the top two arrows, but we're not a good fit, and what happens is we end up leaving the organization. So that's an important part as well. So, and here, this is just the next slide. It's basically a very probably dated, or at least very used analogy, but I think it's an important one, is that, in your typical selection process, you really only see the tip of the iceberg, what someone wants you to see. The reality is we know that the most dangerous part of the iceberg, and also the biggest part of the iceberg, the part that sinks the Titanic, is underneath the water, right? So we really need to be able to have any kind of insight to help us be able to avoid those pitfalls and to have the ability to look at that. And really, again, just kind of on my stump for why to use assessment. Without it, you've got very low quality information, often not job-related information, and a lot of information. And you're comparing often apples to oranges. So the whole idea is really to move to a situation where you have an efficient process where you're able to actually consistently measure, and really when you do those things, you set up a situation where you're following best practices, you're able to really hire for quality, you're able to be legally defensible, all that good stuff. So it's important to think about it that way. It's also important to understand what assessment can and can't do. Even though I'm an evangelist for this stuff, I'm also a realist, and I realize that, the things it can do are really help provide support and informed decision-making, and you'll see me talk about that a lot, right? So the ROI from it really comes from the ability to support your decision makers, your hiring personnel, with data that they can trust to help them integrate into their own information and their own data they've collected throughout the process. It's a supportive, informed decision-making tool. It's not something that's going to tell you everything about every applicant, that's going to solve your problems. If you ever run into an assessment provider that's claiming they're, 75% accurate or 80% accurate, or even, numbers north of 50% is even you're a hero in my field. You got to be, that's a red flag, right? There's just too many things about people, as we know in our other relationships with people. It's very hard to predict all the time what somebody's going to do, and you might drive yourself crazy trying to do so. So be realistic. It's not perfect, but the reality is, as I'll show, it really helps you still. And there's a huge return on investment, even for the levels of accuracy that we're used to experiencing. And so what are assessments all about? I mean, this is really a whole nother webcast, but in general, I think, people are pretty put off by employment tests. The reality of it is that they really have, they are something that is a useful tool that provides insight, and we hope that as they increase in popularity and get a little bit more modern, they become a little less scary and dark and a little more, effective and really something where people understand the value on both sides of the equation, job seekers and hiring organizations. And again, I could fill hours just going over all these different types of tests, but here's kind of the usual suspect, the major things that you see, and certainly there's a lot of opportunity. These things can all get at various and different parts of the individual, and that's really another big core philosophy that I have, is that, and this is especially something where if you are an IO psychologist and you're listening, you could probably agree with me, and if not, I'll just, be really open about it. I think that in the past, my field has focused a lot on individual test. When we talk about validation, we talk about a test. When we talk about, creating a hiring process, we IO guys and gals get the most excited about a test. But the reality is that a hiring decision is the result of a lot more than just a test. It's everything that you use in the process. And so if you just myopically focus on the test itself, you could have the best test in the world surrounded by a bunch of junk, and you're not really going to be able to do yourself any favors. Or the best test in the world that's used incorrectly, not going to help. So I tend to try to look at it as a funnel. This is a model that I've developed with Burson and Associates as a consulting firm that I also do some work with. And you can see here, I don't want to get again into the details, but you move from outside of the funnel where you're trying to brand and attract all the way down to the hiring process. And each step you're really going through successive rounds of evaluation using different sets of tools, and you're investing more into the candidate, right? And so as you get to that verification stage, that's when you start to be collecting data, and you're starting to use things like Check Provides with some good background checking tools. And then you move into the actual onboarding process, and we'll talk a little bit about what this funnel, I've actually got a model that I'll show later where I turn this funnel on its side and show that as you move from onboarding into being an employee of the organization, you've got kind of a reverse funnel where someone can begin to really branch out to a lot of different roles from the ones that they might be in. So that's a pretty interesting connection. And this slide just shows, again, when I'm in an organization and we're taking a job and we break the job down into the various aspects that are important for that job, and we then begin selecting different predictors, how we go about mapping it so that we can see what coverage we have. And generally what you like to see here is something that's the most important part of the job is measured the most times with different methods. So you're getting, a lot of additional data. And so now just kind of moving into a quick understanding of how do we show the value of assessment. This has been something that I think it's always a challenge, even for people like myself who do this for organizations all the time. It requires data feeds that I'll talk about here in a second that are often difficult to obtain, or at least the company really has to want it bad enough to go out there and get that data. We are, though, moving into a new era where, and it's part of this whole idea I have of a golden era based on closed-loop validation and other technology systems where these data feeds are easier to get set up. And once we get them set up, we can really continually evaluate effectiveness. And that's an ideal, dream situation for me. And really, the value of assessment comes from, first of all, a grounding in science, understanding that you have to have reliable and accurate measures that are construct, content valid is very important. And you can use those things to allow you to screen people out. When you talk about the ability to be choosy, that's where assessment tools are really great. There's a concept called selection ratio, and that's just the number of applicants to the number of positions. So let's say you're hiring one position, one person, one seat to fill, and you've got 1,000 applications. Well, you can afford to be really choosy in that situation. You know, if you have one seat to fill and one applicant, you're pretty much stuck. You don't get to be choosy. And when you have assessments, it can really help you understand or give you a mechanism really by which to filter and screen, so that when you're being choosy, you're doing so based on things that are actually related to someone's job performance or ability to do the job. And then the real value proposition comes in understanding your choices and the impact that they have. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit in the rest of this part of the presentation. This slide really just shows the idea that, again, I've said it before in this presentation, I'll say it a million more times, probably in the next year to 2 years, but it's about informed decision making. So test results, what comes out of the assessment process is all geared toward helping your expert decision makers make good decisions consistently. And you probably wonder, why there's a chicken on here other than I missed lunchtime and I'm thinking about a chicken sandwich or something like that. But the reality is it goes to the chicken that they had chosen to pick stocks. And I think this has been about 10 years. Maybe they do it on an ongoing basis, but they'll have a chicken pick stocks and they'll pick against the expert. And honestly, every time I've seen it, it comes out about a wash. The chicken does just about as well as the experts do. And I guess my point here is you got to be better than the chicken. We're actually given some mental powers and clarity that other lower animals don't have, and we got to use that when we're making selection decisions, and we've got to rely on that. So we can be better than random chance. And what does that look like? What does that get us? Well, again, if you're in staffing and HR, you know about a lot of these things, but it's really important for me to continue talking about things like reduced turnover, reduced absences, increases of sales, satisfaction, things that really drive a business. These are the things that make or break you as a business a lot of times. So, assessment is a great tool to help with that. And then there's some less tangible things, and that really also gets into the talent management part of our discussion and presentation today. It's really about things like development, about branding, about building a company, and having the internal human resources that are needed to grow and helping people and use people to do that. So, and again, I'm just going to keep going through slides here where now I start talking about, some of the more geekier stuff. I'll try to keep it at a pretty manageable level, but, again, just showing why assessment's valuable. Here is some just really hypothetical data about, work output. And you can see here that look at the difference between the bottom 20% and the top 80%. And even if you look at from the very bottom person to the very top person, it's almost double. But those people have the same job title. They were probably hired the same exact way. And if you could cut out even those bottom two people and replace them with people that are more like the top people, then think about the overall productivity that you get, right? That's the model here. Assessment really works in two directions. It allows you to screen out the dead weight, the bottom performers, and it also allows you to help identify the top performers. And the better your selection ratio, the choosier you can be, the more you can choose people that are going to end up delivering more output. It's really, really interesting stuff. And so we'll talk a little bit about the concept of test validity. I won't get too far into it because I'll see the meter of people who are attending today drop pretty drastically, so I'll try to keep it pretty interesting. But overall, if you work with testing and employee assessment, you've heard the term validation. It gets batted around, thrown about all the time, and people interpret it differently. But at the end of the day, it really tells us that the test is accurate and that it's measuring what's important for the job. And you really have to have that. If you don't have that, you can't really be sure of what's going on. There's various validation strategies, and again, I don't want to put everyone to sleep going through all of them in great detail. But really the middle one, number 2 here, of concurrent, or what we call criterion-related validation, allows an organization to take the pre-hire test data and correlate that with post-hire data to understand the impact. And that's really what I want to talk about, most today, because that's the strategy that allows you to really, demonstrate rock solid value. The other ones are more just helping you configure and align. And honestly, again, not getting too into it, but a good validation strategy actually leverages several methods at once instead of just relying on one. But here's a real infographic, or really just kind of a model of what validity really looks like. And the example that I like to use is a typing test. If you're going to hire a typist, one of the best ways to understand how well they'll perform in the job, assuming typing is the majority of what they get evaluated on or where they make money for the organization, is a typing test. So let's look at, on the left-hand side, the first scenario of a predictor being something like your GPA. You can see that GPA has pretty much a random relationship to typing speed and accuracy. So if you use that as a predictor, you've pretty much got no validity. If you move into the second situation, administrative experience, well, in that situation, you know what, there's probably a pretty good assumption that if you've been an administrative assistant before, you know how to type. And so, that's going to be a little bit better predictor for you. But if you really want to know how well somebody would type, then you give them a typing test. And it's almost exactly like the job, so it's very easy in this example. That's why I have it as an example, to see that the overlap between how someone does on the predictor and how they do on the job, that's the ROI. That's the validity of the situation. So that's just kind of a visual to show you the more the test measures what the job is all about, the more relative it is, the more related it is, the more ROI one can assume from using it. And that's validity in a nutshell. And here's just another example of, again, how kind of when we geek out and do a lot of regression equations and things like that, you can see that we're looking for people whose assessment data, when we validate, you can see that we correlate supervisory ratings or some kind of job performance data. And the ideal for us is really people who fit around that ellipse, which is kind of buried underneath the circle there, that shows that these are the people that there's the higher scores on the test show higher levels of job performance. And you can see all these outliers scattered all around. Those are the people that you really don't want to hire because their test scores don't have a lot to do with their ability to do the job. So just another way to kind of drive the point home. And, certainly the specific idea of collecting job outcome data and correlating that with pre-hire data is ideal, but there's other ways to evaluate impact as well, right? Thinking about things where you can start looking at, source of hire. I mean, look, we live in an era now of big data, and it's really transforming and changing. I actually just got a book on my desk today that I would highly recommend for people called The Human Face of Big Data. It's a big, giant picture book, and it's an edited series of really awesome articles about how big data is changing our lives. And I just mentioned that because I'm sitting here staring at it on my desk and have been kind of inseparable from that book for the last day or two since I got it. But the idea that everything's a data point, everything is tracked and captured, and now just how easy it is for systems to integrate. We're really getting to a point where we've got a treasure trove of data we can mine through to start looking for meaningful relationships. And that's really the big, mechanism for growth, movement, change, evolution, whatever you call it. And that can also be qualitative feedback as well. And that qualitative feedback is really part of big data. It's feedback, things like, for instance, your Glassdoor, is just an amazing resource now to be able to see, what someone's brand looks like. There's discussion of hiring process in there. You can start evaluating how your hiring process, I have a client who'll be nameless, and that was a big driver for them hiring me was, look, we're getting killed on Glassdoor for various parts of our hiring process. And so they know they needed to change something. And indeed, when I came in there and looked at it, I said, oh, well, no wonder, here's a few things that you can do. And so there really is the ability to get feedback from all kinds of different ways now. And I always encourage my clients to go beyond just the empirical and to think about, the other aspects of your hiring process or even your testing process and how those are accepted. And that includes hiring managers and hiring personnel, recruiters as well. You want them to be able to really feel comfortable with the tools that you're giving them. And again, just cruising through some additional slides here that show some impact in regards to the type of things that assessment can do for companies. Just looking at these circles, there's all kinds of different outcomes, but they all lead to big dollars and huge support of strategic initiatives, right? And then even this broader impact, this gets back to what I was just talking about with the ability to big data. You can start asking questions now and actually going to the data that you've captured in your pre-hiring system and your post-hiring evaluation and start to answer questions like this. We've never really had the ability to do that in the past. And it's certainly not, I don't want to oversimplify it or make it seem like it's, all you have to do is flick a switch to find out the answers to these questions. It still takes effort and intention and, setting up the right infrastructure. But the bottom line is we've just never been positioned to be able to answer and look at these questions in this way. And that's really exciting. And so let's talk a little bit about another thing that's extremely new and, in fact, not something that you don't find a lot now, but we're really setting ourselves up to be able to do. And that's really, again, getting back to this whole kind of concept of a golden era is closed-loop validation, which is really looking at using technology to take the two data feeds that we find most important for validation. That's the hiring process data, the performance data, and being able to set that up so that it's constantly evaluating people's test scores, their job performance, and then allowing you to understand how well your predictive tool is working on an ongoing basis. So validation is really often a snapshot. It's a static thing, but it can be more dynamic. And why is that valuable? Well, I think that we're still finding out reasons for that, other than once you get the infrastructure set up, you don't have to pull teeth to run numbers anymore. Also, jobs change, applicant pools change. The more you're able to be in tune with what's happening and adjust your cut scores and other technical pieces of your hiring process, the more optimized you're going to be. So it's really important to do that. And it also drives a lot of insight, right? And so traditionally in the validation process, the hiring process data, that's pretty much easy to get, right? You have a testing company and they've got your data and you're generally able to share that with them, and you probably retain a lot of your ATS type of data. So everybody's got the hiring process data. It's the post-hire data on someone's performance that's really, really valuable. And that's where, we're starting to find firms that are building in the opportunity to collect that data, right? Once someone gets hired, eventually there'll be a survey that automatically goes out to their manager, or maybe if they're a salesperson, their sales data gets automatically uploaded into the platform, or maybe there's the ability to have ongoing reference check data that can live with people across jobs or even after they get hired, from a 360-degree type evaluation standpoint. So there's a lot of opportunities now to get that number two type of data, which has traditionally been hard. Again, a big part of what I've done over the last 15 years is to do validation studies for companies. And, I can tell you that the hardest part of those studies is inevitably finding the data person in that company and getting them to give us a bunch of raw data files that then have to be, transposed, normalized, cleaned. I mean, that whole process of scrubbing and preparing data once you can even get it from somebody is really tough, and it takes a lot of time and energy. So that's been a limiting factor. And I think that this concept of closed-loop validation helps us move past that in a way that just makes it easier to access the raw data that we need. And so now kind of moving to the last piece, and I think that's a really good bridge, right, when we talk about post-hire data. Well, talent management is really all about the post-hire. It's all about once someone's in an organization, how do you figure out how to optimally use them? You know, they get hired in for one job, and generally, in some cases, people may keep that job for 50 years, but honestly, the norm is that people move around. And if you're lucky and they're good performers, you can keep them in your organization. But how to move them around, where to put them, is a really important thing to think about. So this next slide, you know, why do I have that other than, you know, just an attempt to be humorous here 40 minutes into the presentation and keep everybody's attention is the idea that in the past, you know, the various functions within HR, even within talent acquisition or talent management, are very walled off. I mean, again, I find that all the time. I go into a company to look at their hiring process, and it'll be one group will handle the ATS, one group will handle, you know, sourcing and job boards, one group will handle assessments, but they don't always communicate, and they're not even is a strategic mandate often in the company. There isn't a strategic mandate, for those people to communicate. And when that happens, you know, you're not doing yourself any favors when you start talking about sharing data and needing data from various points to be integrated. So that's my whole, you know, stump speech here is really about thinking about it more strategically and integrating things a little bit better. And so this next slide, again, as I alluded to it earlier, and I'll just leave it on here for people to kind of absorb it. This is a model I developed for Burson and Associates, and in this model you can see we've got all the various pieces of the talent acquisition phase, and then you've got kind of this narrow choke point, which is the hiring. This is when you get hired, you're onboarding. But look at what happens from there. You fan back out to be able to really look at an individual and the data that they have to be able to manage all kinds of things about learning and development and their performance and you know, basically, are they a leader? Are they someone that we want to put into a succession plan? And the outcome of all that is additional data. And the more that we can tie that additional data back to the hiring process and understanding, you know, taking a long-term perspective, our future leaders are coming from this source most often. Our future leaders are people who are scoring in this way on an assessment. And by the way, that assessment is also, we use post-hire assessments as part of our performance management and development that measure the same things as the pre-hire, right? So a big part of this is if you see toward the bottom, that green bar that says competencies, a big part of linking these two things together is a common language across pre and post-hire, and then aligning your data with that common language. So I really like this model. It was kind of an aha moment to me to say, you know, it's really once you get hired, it's the inverse of the hiring process. It's an ability to spread your wings and find different areas within the company. And I think this is all really, you know, supported by the type of things we find post-hire. And again, this is just a little bit of a list. How is assessment used, and how is the data that comes out of assessment valuable across these things, right? So again, I'm not going to read every bullet point on the list, but just take a look and you can see that it's about decision making again. It's about measurement. It's really the same stuff that you see pre-hire, but used for a different way. And I think that a real important thing about, you know, closing the loop here is really around syncing the language that we use and the data that come out of it. And here's just another slide that I wanted to put in here that just shows a little bit about the major differences between what you're doing pre and post hire. In the pre-hire, it's really about differentiation. You don't know somebody, you're trying to quickly for the cheapest cost, evaluate them in order to see if they're a good fit or not. Post-hire, it's a lot more about optimization, diagnosis, management of performance. But again, all that stuff yields data, and as you go through those steps, that data is valuable, and when you close the loop, it shows you pre-hire how to do it right. So again, just talking about the fact that data is really the most critical thing here. And now we really have, again, why, just kind of wrapping up, why do I really keep talking about it as a golden era, and where we're going is that the technology platforms that we have now and really the insight that we've gained allow us the ability to connect the dots in a way that we haven't been able to do. And the data is going to show us a lot of really interesting stuff. I think that, to really get where we need to go, we need to be taking a very longitudinal and long-term focus. And we're just so at the beginning of this right now that we haven't really been able to benefit from that. 5 and 10 years down the road, I think we're really going to see a lot of insight that's been gained about the things that you find in a hiring situation and what that means for the long run and what kind of value that returns. So it's very exciting, to someone like me to be alive and kicking really in the meat of my career during this time. It's a real pivotal time, I believe. And so now I just kind of want to move more into the kind of brain connection here, and be able to answer questions, and also just talk to Greg and about what Check's been doing, or in general just questions about how what I've been talking about apply. So
great.
I'll shut up now and turn it back over to you, Greg.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Charles. That was terrific. We've got a ton of questions coming in, and just want to remind anybody to keep asking the questions. Go ahead, and we'll get to as many as we can here. But interesting when you talk about the whole golden age concept, and really as being around closing the loop. And one of the questions that we've seen come through a couple times during the course of your presentation is, how do you start, right? If you're an HR manager today and you want to just start this process of data collection and good data collection to start closing that loop, where do you begin?
Right. I think it's a great question, and it's also one that's it's a little scary, right? I mean, I'm talking about, and that's just kind of who I am sometimes. I start talking about a lot of pie in the sky kind of things that are really big picture, but the reality is that you've got to focus on what's meaningful in the present state. So to me, what I often look for is the low-hanging fruit. Where is there a fire to put out, especially if you don't have any experience with assessment? Is there an area where your hiring process or the people that are in the job are causing a problem? So maybe it's turnover, maybe it's you're not being able to sell enough product, maybe your frontline people aren't friendly enough. You go back to the things that are measured and evaluated on a daily basis, that where the company knows they're bleeding. How can we change the hiring process in an isolated case to help that? Because that's really, especially if you have very little experience, that's really a great way to get started. So an example I would say would be, the number one thing I would say, survey says number one reason people use pre-hire assessment, turnover. So if you have that problem, it's good to really take a look at the hiring process for that job, and then try to say, what can we do to predict who's going to leave more quickly, and how can we evaluate the impact of that? Again, talking about the post-hire data stream, turnover is a real and easy to collect metric. You don't have to go out of your way and create any special surveys or forms to evaluate turnover. It's generally in your HRIS system. You can generally track it. And so, use an assessment tool that's been shown to reduce turnover in similar situations. That's going to help you understand that you're using the right tool for the job. Implement it correctly, and then measure down the line and really create a story that you can tell. That's what it's all about. It's about collecting the information to go back and tell a story and say, you know what, we tried this way, we followed these steps, and here's the results. Now maybe we can replicate that model in other areas.
Yeah.
You know, that's how you get started.
You know, one of the things we did a webinar earlier this week with another organization. One of the things that we talked about in there was, you know, we got the same kind of question around data collection, and one of the things that we said is, look, you know, collecting turnover is a great place to start, but you know, one really easy place to start too is starting to collect rehire information, right? If you're not diligent about that, it's just a really good way to start collecting some basic performance data, and that's really what it is, right? It's going back and you know, and after a reasonable period of time, starting to collect some rehire data and using that if you're having trouble pulling together the real performance data, you know, that can be a real simple place to start as well.
Yeah, definitely.
We've got a few questions around background checking, and from Marty and David and a couple other people who asked very similar questions. So I'm gonna, if those guys don't mind, I'm gonna kind of take the liberty here of sort of lumping them all together, but. Talk a little bit about how to perform an effective background check in you know, in today's climate where I think a lot, you know, where a few of our attendees have said that, you know, HR departments are sort of dealing with only really verifying employment dates and positions and things about that and things like that. Can you talk about that a little bit as well?
Yeah, and you know, I'm going to be completely honest and say that although it's well within my, you know, bailiwick, it's not my power alley, right? So I don't deal with that stuff on a daily basis as much as I do the IQ tests and the simulations and things like that. Generally, though, I think that the background check, it really is, in my mind, it needs to be job related, just like anything else, right? So if you turn up the fact that someone's got some parking tickets or a speeding ticket or something, you know, if that's not related to their job performance, or even in the case of something like a, you know, a driving record check for somebody who's going to not be driving on the job. Those kind of things start to get you into some trouble territory.
Yeah.
You need to keep the stuff you look at job related. I think the other interesting thing about it is that, you know, it's all database driven. So, well, when you get to like a testing, there's a vast difference between testing companies in the quality and the methodologies they use. When you get to background checking, I think, you know, you're all fishing in the same database. I think many companies have a competitive advantage by having additional databases or being able to do it quickly, but there's still that you're kind of relying on a passive information. I guess I would almost, you know, turn it back to you a little bit too, Greg, and ask, you know, how does what checked does in terms of reference checking fall into that category?
Yeah,
because I think that would be part of it, right?
Yeah, I think, you know, the first thing that one of the things that we tell people all the time is, first of all, it's separating reference checking from background checking, right? A lot of times the two get lumped in together, and you know, where background checking, you know, is certainly it's risk mitigation, it's you know, criminal records or credit records if it's applicable and things like that. You know, but really kind of, and you're right, and everything you said about background checking, it's, you know, just keeping a job relevant is the big thing. Don't start checking stuff that you don't need, that's just has nothing to do with the job whatsoever. But on the reference checking side, I think, again, at the risk of, you know, sort of being blatantly, you know, salesy here, and I don't mean to be, but, you know, there are tools that are on the market today. Checked is obviously one. There are others where we're actually taking performance information and bringing it into that reference check to make it an assessment, right? And delivering a form of assessment to candidates in a very, very, very brief manner, but collecting assessment-based and competency and trait-based information from references. Again, what that does is not only makes it really fast and really easy because you're doing it online, but it also makes it job relevant and predictive. And that's a really key part. So it's really separating those two things, I think, is the key, and really, you know, leveraging technology and you know, it's assessment being used in a different place in the selection process than we've seen before.
Right.
Have another question here that just came in. I think it's a great question because I think this is something that a lot of us have seen before, and the question is really around an organization where they're finding that people who stay the longest are their lowest performers. You've never heard this one before, right? And
I have, definitely.
You know, right? Absolutely, it's a major problem. And talk about, you know, really a need to do some concurrent validation for tenure that really affects performance. How do they address a situation like that? How does a company handle a situation like that?
Right. Oh, that's a good question, and I'm going to honestly, I'm not really. Let me think about that. So, I mean, it's not like what I don't want to say is, well, you just get rid of those people, because that's obviously not a good strategy, and it's not always doable either. And you're not doing the best job as being a corporate citizen if you're just letting people go all the time. Maybe the reason why, though, people aren't doing well in a job is because they're not in the best job for them. So I would turn that around to the development program you have, and the ability for you to work with people and understand where they fit best. I mean, that's really the essence of talent management, is putting people in the right place so that they can be leveraging their strengths. And then also, if they're weak in some area, figuring out what that is and giving them some coaching or development opportunities. I think that's also really important. So to me, I would look at that as, a situation where just because someone's been hired and they're not working out doesn't always necessarily mean that it's a wash and you just got to flush them. Maybe there's a way to optimize and to really put that person in a position to be more successful. And maybe that's on the company's, talent management, development type of, activities.
Well, I think also, though, too, Charles, couldn't you spin that around a little bit? And, in that situation where, if assessments are going to tell you, we have conversations with clients around this all the time. Assessments are going to tell you exactly the answer to the question you ask, right? So if you are building benchmarks within your assessment that deal with turnover, right? And your assessment is calibrated to find candidates who will stay the longest. Well, if that's the way you build your benchmark, that's the output you're going to get, right? You're going to get candidates who will stay the longest. So I think what it sounds like to me there is that there may be a little bit of a situation where the underlying benchmarks are not constructed to really affect performance, but they're really constructed to affect turnover.
Yeah, that's good insight. Yeah, I would agree with you. I hadn't thought about it that way, but I think that's very legitimate.
Next question here is around, you talked about a concept of selection ratio. And I had a good question come in saying, what if you're screening in a poor candidate market? Like, what if you have got a job that you're hiring for where you just have very few candidates? Does that mean that assessment isn't going to be valuable?
Yeah, and that's a great question. It's one of those ones. There's a handful of questions where, you really legitimately calls into play some, weaknesses or places where it's less ideal. I would still feel like it's an important thing to do. One of the things that you can do is there's another concept of, your cut score that is inexorably bound to your selection ratio, right? So your cut score is just the threshold above which on a test, if you have a test where there is an absolute need to have a score that will select someone in or out. So the first part of the answer to that is, you may not need to have the test be an all or none type thing. It may not be, look, if you can't pass this test, you can't get hired. But maybe it's the ability to, again, collect additional data, because even if you got a lot of dud candidates, there's still a range of variability in them, and you might want to look for things that would help you understand who's going to be able to be developed the best, or even just to know what you're getting when someone comes into the company, where someone's strong or weak. A strong or weak candidate may not look the same, or I'm sorry, different weak candidates may not look the same. They may have different strengths and weaknesses. So that part is important. And if you absolutely are using a cut score or a threshold score value, you can then just lower that. That you can have with a great selection ratio and 1,000 candidates for one position, you can set that cut score at 95, because inevitably you're going to have a couple candidates, most likely, who've scored above 95, so you'll be able to really be choosing the cream of the crop. Well, if you set it at 95 and then you got nobody to hire, you just start lowering it until you find the area where the top score is, and then you can at least hire to that. So there's some ways to play with it. I think that the bottom line is you don't necessarily have to use assessment as an all or nothing, in or out proposition. It's just another piece of data, and it still has value even with a crappy selection ratio. Does that make sense?
Sorry about that. I have myself on mute there. We are right up to the top of the hour here. It's great to have you on. I know, unfortunately, I apologize to everybody. We've got a pile of questions still coming in, and that we didn't get a chance to get to. What I'll tell you, if you're on is that this was recorded. This will be posted. We'll send everybody a link to where you can find this. Maybe if Charles doesn't mind, I'll try to package up some of these questions that people asked that we didn't get to. Maybe we can try to get some answers up with the recording online.
Yeah.
Yeah. Before you go here, Charles, give us the quick pitch on what's going on with Rocket Hire today and how people can contact you.
Yeah, sure. Well, my website is pretty widely available, and we're just helping companies do a wide range of things around selecting the right assessment tools and making sure those are effective. And we also build assessment tools. Pretty much anything in this realm we do, and we work with all kinds of corporations all over the world, and I'm always happy to learn about new situations and how we can help new people get involved with this stuff and make the most of it.
Absolutely. And as a reminder too, if you're interested in check.com and the type of web applications for talent selection that we provide, we do a lot of the stuff that Charles was talking about today. Go to our website at check.com, and that's also where the link for the recording will be. When you log off today, you're going to be asked a quick survey. Please take a minute, answer those survey questions. It'll just take you a second. Thank you so much for being online with us today and joining us. Hope you join us for a future webinar, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Thanks.